Welcome to Untold Stories of Freddie Mercury. If this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And now, let's dive into today's unforgettable story. The lights blazed down on Wembley Stadium like fallen stars, casting their golden glow across a sea of 72,000 faces. It was July 11th, 1986, and Queen had just launched into their third song of the evening. The crowd moved as one massive organism, swaying and singing with a devotion that bordered on religious fervor. From the stage, Freddie Mercury commanded this ocean of humanity with the same ease that a conductor guides a symphony orchestra. The energy was electric, almost tangible in the humid London air. Freddie prowled the stage like a caged panther finally set free, his white tank top already damp with perspiration, his voice soaring above the thunderous accompaniment of Brian May's guitar, Roger Taylor's drums, and John Deacon's bass. This was what he lived for. These moments when the boundary between performer and audience dissolved completely, when music became something greater than the sum of its parts. The crowd pressed forward against the barriers, a living wall of excitement and anticipation. Security guards stood at regular intervals, their eyes constantly scanning for any signs of trouble, but tonight felt different. There was something pure about this audience, something that reminded Freddie why he had fallen in love with performing in the first place. These weren't just fans. They were believers, pilgrims who had traveled from across the globe to witness something magical. As the band transitioned into the opening chords of their next number, Freddie noticed the usual signs of an engaged crowd, arms raised high, voices joining in perfect harmony, the occasional flash of a camera capturing moments that would become treasured memories. The front rows were packed with the most dedicated fans, those who had arrived hours early, who knew every word to every song, who had painted their faces with the band's logo and wore homemade costumes that showed their devotion. The stage lights shifted, painting the crowd in waves of blue and gold, and Freddie felt that familiar rush of adrenaline that came with knowing he was exactly where he belonged. This was his element, his natural habitat. The stage wasn't just a platform, it was his kingdom. And these thousands of people weren't just an audience, they were his subjects, willingly surrendering themselves to the power of his voice and presence. But even in the midst of this euphoria, Freddie's performer's instincts remained sharp. Years of experience had taught him to read a crowd like a book, to notice the subtle shifts in energy, the small details that could make the difference between a good show and a legendary one. His eyes constantly moved across the sea of faces, making connections, sharing moments, ensuring that even in a venue this massive, the experience felt intimate and personal. The music pulsed through the stadium's massive sound system, each note perfectly calibrated to reach every corner of the venue. The bass line thrummed through the concrete structure, vibrating up through the feet of every person present. This was more than a concert. It was a shared experience that would bind these 72,000 strangers together for the rest of their lives. As Freddie spun across the stage, his movements fluid and graceful despite the intensity of the performance, he caught glimpses of individual faces in the crowd. A young woman in the third row singing with tears streaming down her cheeks. A father holding his teenage son on his shoulders, both of them lost in the music. An elderly couple who had clearly dressed up for the occasion, their faces glowing with joy and wonder. These were the moments that made everything worthwhile, the late nights, the exhaustion, the constant pressure of being in the public eye. When Freddie saw the pure happiness on these faces, when he witnessed the power of music to transform ordinary people into something extraordinary, he remembered why he had chosen this life, why he had sacrificed so much for the chance to stand on stages like this one. The song was building to its crescendo when something in the crowd caught his attention, a subtle shift in the energy that his trained eye immediately recognized as different from the usual concert dynamics. It started as the smallest disturbance in the vast ocean of bodies, barely perceptible to anyone except someone who had spent decades reading crowds like sacred texts. Freddie's eyes, sharp as a hawk's despite the blazing stage lights, caught the subtle shift in movement near the left side of the stage, about 15 rows back from the barrier, where moments before there had been unified, swaying and singing. Now there was a different kind of motion, urgent, concerned, protective. The music continued to surge around him, Brian's guitar weaving intricate melodies that seemed to paint colors in the air, but Freddie's attention had become divided. His body moved through the familiar choreography of the song, his voice hitting every note with practiced precision. Yet his mind was entirely focused on that small section of the crowd where something was clearly wrong. He watched as the people in that area began to turn inward, forming a protective circle around something he couldn't yet see. Their faces, which moments before had been turned toward the stage in rapturous attention, were now looking down with expressions of concern and worry. The wave-like motion of the crowd, usually so rhythmic and predictable, had developed an irregular pattern as people tried to create space where there had been none. Years of performing had taught Freddie to multitask in ways that seemed almost supernatural. He could deliver a flawless vocal performance while simultaneously monitoring the crowd for signs of trouble, adjusting his stage movements to accommodate technical difficulties, and maintaining the emotional connection that made Queen's live shows legendary. But this moment felt different. The disturbance in the crowd wasn't the usual pushing or minor scuffle that security could handle quietly. This was something that demanded immediate attention. The young woman at the center of the commotion had been singing along with passionate intensity just moments before. She was perhaps 19 or 20, with long brown hair that caught the stage lights as she moved. She had been one of those fans who knew every word, every inflection, her face glowing with the pure joy that came from experiencing her musical heroes in person. Her homemade Queen t-shirt, carefully crafted with fabric paint and rhinestones, marked her as one of the truly devoted followers who had probably saved for months to afford this ticket. But the combination of factors that made rock concerts so exhilarating, the crushing crowd, the intense heat generated by thousands of bodies pressed together, the overwhelming sensory experience of lights and sound, the emotional intensity of the music itself, had proven too much for her system to handle. The dehydration that had been building throughout the day, combined with the adrenaline rush of being so close to her idols, had finally overwhelmed her body's ability to cope. As she began to sway unsteadily, the fans around her immediately recognized the signs. These were experienced concertgoers who had seen this happen before, who understood the unwritten code of looking out for one another in situations like this. They moved with practiced efficiency, creating a protective barrier around her as her knees buckled and she began to collapse. From the stage, Freddie watched this human drama unfold with growing concern. He could see the way the crowd was responding, the genuine care and worry on their faces, as they tried to help someone they had never met but who was, in this moment, part of their extended family. This was what he loved most about Queen's audiences. They weren't just individual fans. They were a community bound together by their shared love of the music. The song was approaching its bridge, a moment that typically called for increased interaction with the audience, but Freddie found himself unable to look away from the developing situation. His performer's instincts told him to continue the show, to trust that security would handle whatever was happening, but something deeper, something fundamentally human, was pulling his attention toward that small circle of concerned faces in the crowd. The music swelled around him, but for the first time in his career, Freddie Mercury felt the irresistible urge to stop everything and focus on a single person in his audience. The moment arrived like a lightning strike of clarity cutting through the chaos of performance. Freddie's hand moved instinctively toward his microphone stand, his fingers wrapping around the cold metal, as his mind made a decision that would echo through the decades of rock and roll history. The song was building toward its most powerful section, the moment when 72,000 voices would typically join his in a chorus that could be heard for miles around London. But something far more important was happening in the crowd. The young woman had fully collapsed now, her body going limp as the fans around her caught her before she could hit the ground. Freddie could see the panic in their faces, the way they looked desperately toward the stage, and then back at their unconscious friend, unsure of what to do next. Security guards were beginning to notice the disturbance, but they were still several rows away, fighting through the dense crowd to reach the area where help was needed. In that split second, Freddie Mercury faced a choice that would define not just this performance, but his entire legacy as an artist. He could continue the song, trust that the situation would be handled by others, and maintain the momentum of what was shaping up to be one of Queen's most electrifying performances. The professional thing to do, the expected thing, would be to keep going. After all, 72,000 people had paid to see a show, and stopping mid-song for one person seemed almost absurd from a business perspective. But Freddie had never been one to choose the expected path. His entire career had been built on moments of spontaneous humanity, on the belief that music was about connection rather than mere entertainment. As he watched the concerned faces of the fans trying to help their fallen friend, he saw something that reminded him why he had fallen in love with performing in the first place. These weren't just customers or audience members. They were human beings who had come together to share something beautiful, and one of them needed help. The decision crystallized in his mind with perfect clarity. Without hesitation, Freddie stepped back from the microphone and raised his hand toward his bandmates. Brian May, ever attuned to his frontman's signals, caught the gesture immediately and began to slow his guitar playing. Roger Taylor's drumming gradually decreased in intensity, and John Deacon followed suit with his bass line. The music didn't stop abruptly. That would have been jarring and unprofessional. But it began to fade in a way that suggested something important was about to happen. The crowd, initially confused by the unexpected change in the song's progression, began to sense that something significant was occurring. The singing gradually died down as people tried to understand what was happening on stage. Freddie's body language had shifted completely. Gone was the theatrical performer, replaced by someone who was clearly focused on something beyond the music. As the instruments faded to silence, an unusual quiet began to settle over Wembley Stadium. It wasn't the complete silence of an empty venue, but rather the hushed anticipation of 72,000 people who suddenly realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. The ambient sounds of the massive crowd, the rustling of clothing, the occasional cough, the distant hum of the sound system, became audible in a way they never were during a typical performance. Freddie stood at the center of the stage, his chest rising and falling from the exertion of the previous songs, his eyes fixed on that small section of the crowd where the drama was unfolding. The stage lights, which had been programmed to shift and change with the music, now cast a steady glow across his figure, making him appear almost ethereal against the darkened backdrop of the stadium. In the crowd, the fans surrounding the unconscious young woman looked up toward the stage with a mixture of hope and desperation, still unsure if their silent pleas for help had been noticed. The silence that followed was unlike anything Wembley Stadium had ever experienced. Freddie Mercury stood motionless at the center of the stage, his usually animated presence now focused with laser-like intensity on a single point in the vast sea of humanity before him. The absence of music created a vacuum that seemed to amplify every heartbeat, every breath, every whispered concern from the crowd. Slowly, deliberately, Freddie walked toward the edge of the stage, his movements carrying none of his usual theatrical flair. This wasn't a performance. This was something far more genuine and immediate. The stage lights followed his movement, creating a spotlight that seemed to connect him directly to the area where the young woman had collapsed. As he approached the barrier that separated performer from audience, the crowd in the front rows could see something in his eyes they had never witnessed before. Not the confident showman they knew and loved, but a man genuinely concerned about another human being. The fans who had been helping the unconscious woman looked up to see Freddie Mercury himself, pointing directly at them, his face etched with unmistakable concern. The realization that their musical hero had not only noticed their situation, but had actually stopped the entire show to address it, sent ripples of amazement through the immediate area. Word began to spread through the crowd like wildfire. Freddie had seen what was happening, and he cared enough to act. Security personnel, who had been struggling to navigate through the dense crowd, suddenly found their path clearing as fans realized what was happening and began to cooperate in ways that transformed the usual chaos of crowd control into something resembling organized assistance. The guards moved with renewed urgency, understanding that they were no longer just maintaining order, but participating in something that their boss on stage had deemed important enough to halt the entire performance. From his elevated position, Freddie could see the security team finally reaching the area where the young woman lay unconscious in the arms of her fellow fans. He watched as the trained professionals took over, their movements efficient and practiced as they assessed her condition and began the process of safely extracting her from the crowd. The fans who had been helping stepped back willingly, their faces showing relief that proper help had arrived. The entire stadium had become aware that something extraordinary was happening. Conversations buzzed through the crowd as people tried to understand why the music had stopped, why their larger-than-life frontman was standing silently at the edge of the stage. why security was moving with such purpose through a specific section of the audience. Those close enough to see what was happening began explaining to those around them, and the story spread through the venue like a wave. What struck everyone who witnessed this moment was the complete transformation in Freddie's demeanor. Gone was the flamboyant performer who commanded attention through sheer force of personality. In his place stood a man who had willingly surrendered the spotlight to focus on someone else's need. The contrast was startling and deeply moving. Here was one of the world's biggest rock stars, in the middle of what should have been his moment of triumph, choosing instead to use his power and platform to help a single fan in distress. The medical team had arrived now, their professional equipment and expertise taking over from the well-meaning but limited assistance of the surrounding fans. Freddie remained at the edge of the stage, his eyes tracking their every movement, his body language conveying a tension that wouldn't be released until he knew the young woman was safe. In that moment, 72,000 people learned something profound about the man they had come to see perform. Minutes stretched like hours as Freddie maintained his position at the edge of the stage, his eyes never leaving the medical team working in the crowd below. The paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, their fluorescent vests creating a small island of authority in the sea of concerned faces. Oxygen was administered, vital signs were checked, and slowly but surely, the young woman began to show signs of recovery. The crowd around the medical emergency had transformed into something beautiful and unexpected. What could have been a chaotic situation had instead become a demonstration of collective humanity. Fans who had never met each other worked together to create space for the paramedics, passing water bottles forward from those who had them, and maintaining a respectful silence that allowed the medical professionals to do their work without interference. Freddie watched as the young woman's eyes fluttered open, her consciousness returning gradually as the oxygen and medical attention took effect. Even from his distance on the stage, he could see the moment when awareness returned to her face. The confusion, then the gradual realization of where she was and what had happened. The relief that washed over the faces of the fans who had been helping her was visible even from the stage, and Freddie felt his own tension begin to ease. The paramedic closest to the stage looked up and gave a clear thumbs-up signal, indicating that the situation was under control and the patient was stable. This simple gesture, meant primarily for the security personnel coordinating the response, was clearly visible to Freddie, and the relief that flooded through him was palpable. His shoulders relaxed for the first time since he had noticed the disturbance, and a small smile began to play at the corners of his mouth. But Freddie wasn't finished yet. He remained at the edge of the stage, watching as the medical team helped the young woman to her feet. She was clearly still weak and disoriented, but she was conscious and responsive. The decision was made to escort her to the medical facility within the stadium for further evaluation and recovery, and Freddie watched every step of this process with the attention of someone personally invested in the outcome. As the small procession began to move through the crowd toward the exit, something magical happened. The fans along their path began to applaud, not the thunderous, rhythmic clapping of a concert audience, but the gentle, respectful applause reserved for moments of genuine human triumph. It was the sound of 72,000 people celebrating the fact that one of their own was going to be okay. The young woman, supported by paramedics but walking under her own power, looked back toward the stage as she was being escorted out. Even in her weakened state, the realization of what had happened, that Freddie Mercury had stopped an entire Queen concert because he was concerned about her, was clearly overwhelming. The expression on her face was one of disbelief, mixed with profound gratitude. Freddie, seeing her looking back at the stage, raised his hand in a gentle wave, not the theatrical gesture of a performer acknowledging applause, but the simple, human acknowledgement of one person wishing another well. The gesture was small, almost intimate despite being witnessed by tens of thousands, and it perfectly captured the essence of what had just transpired. As the medical team and their patient disappeared into the stadium's corridors, Freddie finally stepped back from the edge of the stage. The immediate crisis had passed, the young woman was safe, and now he faced the task of returning to the performance. But something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere of Wembley Stadium. The atmosphere in Wembley Stadium had undergone a profound metamorphosis. What had begun as a typical rock concert, albeit one featuring one of the world's greatest bands, had evolved into something far more meaningful and intimate. The 72,000 people who filled the venue were no longer simply an audience. They had become witnesses to an act of genuine humanity that would reshape their understanding of what it meant to be a performer and what it meant to be human. Freddie walked back toward the center of the stage, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. The theatrical swagger that typically characterized his stage presence had been replaced by something more grounded, more real. He picked up his microphone stand, wrapping his fingers around the familiar metal, but even this simple action carried a different weight now. The instrument that had been a tool for entertainment had become a conduit for something deeper. Brian May, Roger Taylor, and John Deacon watched their frontman with a mixture of admiration and understanding. They had performed with Freddie for years, had witnessed his spontaneous acts of kindness and his genuine care for their fans, but even they seemed moved by what had just transpired. The bond between the band members, already strong from years of shared experiences, had been strengthened by this moment of collective humanity. The crowd's energy had shifted dramatically. Where before there had been the excited anticipation typical of a rock concert, now there was something approaching reverence. People looked at the stage differently, looked at Freddie differently. They had seen behind the persona of the rock star to glimpse the man beneath, and what they had found there was someone who valued human life and dignity above entertainment and spectacle. Conversations rippled through the audience as people processed what they had just witnessed. Strangers turned to each other, sharing their amazement at what Freddie had done. The story was already beginning to take on the quality of legend, how Freddie Mercury had stopped an entire Queen concert to help a single fan. But for those who were there, who had seen it happen in real time, it was more than a story. It was a moment that would define their relationship with music and performance for the rest of their lives. The technical crew, who had been prepared to continue with the planned setlist, now waited for direction from their frontman. The lighting technicians held their positions, ready to resume the programmed light show, while the sound engineers monitored their equipment, ensuring everything was ready for whatever came next. Even these seasoned professionals, who had worked countless concerts and seen every kind of performer, seemed affected by what had just occurred. Freddie stood in the center of the stage, looking out at the sea of faces that now regarded him with a new kind of respect and affection. The love had always been there. Queen's fans were legendary for their devotion, but now it was mixed with something deeper. They had seen their hero make a choice that revealed his character, and they loved him not just for his talent, but for his humanity. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of a shared moment, of collective understanding, of 72,000 people processing an experience that none of them would ever forget. In that quiet, Freddie seemed to be gathering himself, preparing to transition back into performance mode, while somehow maintaining the connection that had just been forged. The stage lights remained steady, casting Freddie in a warm glow that seemed to emphasize the transformation that had taken place. He was still the same performer they had come to see, but he was also something more, a reminder that behind every larger-than-life persona was a human being capable of extraordinary compassion. When Freddie finally raised the microphone to his lips, the gesture carried the weight of everything that had just transpired. The simple act of preparing to sing again felt monumental, as if he were not just resuming a concert, but beginning an entirely new kind of performance. The connection between artist and audience had been fundamentally altered, deepened in ways that neither party had anticipated when the evening began. The first note that emerged from his throat was different from anything he had produced earlier in the show. It carried within it the emotion of the past several minutes, the concern, the relief, the profound humanity that had been displayed for all to witness. The sound seemed to resonate, not just through the stadium's sound system, but through the very souls of everyone present. It was as if Freddie's voice had been transformed by the experience, imbued with a new depth and meaning. Brian's guitar joined in, the notes flowing with an almost reverent quality that perfectly complemented the changed atmosphere. Roger's drumming, when it entered, was more nuanced than before, less about driving rhythm and more about supporting the emotional journey that the entire stadium was now sharing. John's bass provided a foundation that felt solid and reassuring, like the steady heartbeat of a community that had just experienced something profound together. The song they chose to resume with was not the one they had been performing when the interruption occurred. Instead, Freddie had instinctively selected something that felt appropriate for the moment, a piece that could serve as both a continuation of the concert and an acknowledgement of what had just happened. The music flowed with an organic quality that suggested it was being created in real time, shaped by the collective emotion of the moment. The audience's response was unlike anything Queen had ever experienced. The singing that rose from the crowd was not the usual enthusiastic participation of a rock concert, but something approaching a spiritual experience. Voices blended together in harmonies that seemed to emerge spontaneously, as if the shared experience had created a temporary choir of 72,000 members. The sound was beautiful and haunting, a testament to the power of music to unite people in moments of genuine emotion. Throughout the stadium, people found themselves moved to tears, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming beauty of what they were witnessing. The combination of Freddie's transformed performance, the band's sensitive accompaniment, and the audience's heartfelt participation had created something that transcended entertainment and entered the realm of art in its purest form. Freddie moved across the stage with a grace that seemed almost ethereal. His usual theatrical gestures had been replaced by movements that felt more natural, more connected to the music and the moment. Every step, every gesture, every expression seemed to acknowledge the bond that had been forged between performer and audience through their shared experience of human compassion. The lighting design, which had been programmed for a typical rock show, was being adjusted in real time by technicians who understood that they were no longer supporting mere entertainment, but participating in something approaching a religious experience. The lights moved more slowly, more thoughtfully, creating an atmosphere that supported the transformed nature of the performance. As the song progressed, it became clear that this was no longer the same concert that had begun hours earlier. The interruption, rather than breaking the flow of the evening, had elevated it to something unprecedented. The audience was no longer watching a performance. They were participating in a moment of collective transcendence, united by their shared witness to an act of pure humanity. The music swelled around them, carrying everyone present into a space where the boundaries between performer and audience, between individual and community, seemed to dissolve entirely. As the final notes of the evening echoed through Wembley Stadium, something extraordinary had been born from what should have been an ordinary concert. The 72,000 people who began to file out of the venue carried with them more than memories of great music. They carried the profound understanding that they had witnessed something that would define their relationship with art, humanity, and compassion for the rest of their lives. The young woman who had fainted, now recovered and resting in the stadium's medical facility, would later learn the full extent of what her moment of distress had triggered. When she discovered that Freddie Mercury had stopped an entire Queen concert because he was concerned about her well-being, the knowledge would overwhelm her with a gratitude that words could never adequately express. She would carry this story with her always, not as a tale of her own misfortune, but as proof that genuine kindness still existed in a world that often seemed to have forgotten its value. For Freddie himself, the evening had revealed something fundamental about the relationship between performer and audience that he had always sensed but never fully understood. The power he wielded on stage was not just about entertainment or even artistic expression. It was about the responsibility that came with being able to influence and inspire others. The decision to stop the show had been instinctive, driven by his basic human decency, but its impact had shown him the true potential of his platform. The other members of Queen, Brian, Roger, and John, had been moved by their frontman's actions in ways that would deepen their respect for him and strengthen their bond as a band. They had always known Freddie was special, but witnessing his willingness to sacrifice the momentum of a performance for the welfare of a single fan had shown them a side of his character that made them proud to share the stage with him. The story of that night would spread far beyond the confines of Wembley Stadium. In an era before social media, when news traveled through word of mouth and traditional media, the tale of Freddie Mercury stopping a concert to help a fan would become legend. Music journalists would write about it, fans would share it with friends, and it would become part of the mythology that surrounded Queen and their extraordinary frontman. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the thousands of people who were there to witness it firsthand. They would go home and tell their families, their friends, their children about the night they saw a rock star choose humanity over showmanship. The story would be passed down through generations, becoming a touchstone for discussions about what it means to be truly successful, truly powerful, and truly human. Years later, when Freddie Mercury's life was cut tragically short, this moment would be remembered as one of the perfect examples of who he really was beneath the theatrical persona. It would stand alongside his musical achievements as evidence of a man who understood that true greatness lay not in commanding attention, but in using that attention to make the world a little bit better. The young woman in the crowd had fainted from the heat and excitement of a summer evening at Wembley, but what emerged from that moment of vulnerability was something far more powerful than anyone could have anticipated. It was a demonstration that in a world often divided by differences, music and basic human compassion could create connections that transcended all boundaries. That night at Wembley, Freddie Mercury had shown 72,000 people what it looked like when a legend chose to be human, and in doing so, he had become more legendary than ever. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming emotional and inspiring tales about Freddie's life and legacy. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and often your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time.